I was there for all of it. I am the Duke of Veldmore's younger brother, and I have had the particular pleasure and occasional torment of standing close enough to witness the best and worst moments of his life. I was at Waterloo for the worst. I was at Ravensmere Park that autumn for the best. And because my brother has never in his life narrated anything about himself, the duty falls to me. His name, as I said, is Veldmore. The title is the War Duke, though he dislikes the epithet, says it makes him sound like a field implement. The rest of England disagrees. He held the line at 3 engagements no one else believed were holdable, brought his men home from a 4th when every tactical authority had written them off, and came back to England with more scars than he will ever inventory for polite company, and a silence about the war that nothing has ever cracked. He was 38 at the time of this story. I was 33. We look nothing alike. I have our mother's fair coloring and a face that has been called pleasant, which I take as a coded remark about my harmlessness. My brother has our grandfather's darkness. Black hair threaded at the temples with the first iron of early gray, a jaw that could anchor a frigate, and eyes the color of the slate cliffs along the Veldmore coast, which is to say, not precisely gray and not precisely blue, but the color of something that has survived a great deal of weather and is not done surviving. He had been back from the continent for 3 years when the Ravensmere house party occurred. In those 3 years, he had done the following: administered his estate with a precision his steward called frightening, declined 11 invitations to dinners where unmarried daughters would be present, and made 2 appearances at the Lords to vote on measures he cared about and ignore everything else. Society had largely given up on him as a matrimonial prospect. Society's mothers had not, which is a different thing entirely. The Ravensmere Park gathering was Lady Holbeck's idea, or rather, it was the idea of our uncle, Lord Creswick, filtered through Lady Holbeck's particular talent for appearing to have the ideas that Creswick plants. My uncle is our late father's elder brother, a man of magnificent self-confidence and narrow sympathies. He had decided, sometime in the year prior, that my brother's continued bachelorhood was an embarrassment to the family line, a disservice to the duchy, and a personal affront to himself. He had also decided, with the certainty that characterizes all of his decisions, that the solution was Lady Edwina Ashton, daughter of the Earl of Ashton, a young woman of excellent breeding, impeccable connections, a respectable dowry, and absolutely no observable interiority. I say this without malice. I spoke with Lady Edwina twice during the week at Ravensmere. She was pleasant. She was pretty in the way that well-bred young women in that era were often pretty, as though prettiness had been installed as a feature, like the chandeliers at Ravensmere, both costly and reliably impersonal. She had no strong opinions about anything I raised, which, in fairness, may have been a function of not wanting to seem unfeminine rather than actual vacuousness. But she left no impression. You looked at her and saw the category rather than the person inside it. My brother, as it turned out, felt precisely the same, though he expressed it by simply failing to look at her when there were other things to see. We arrived at Ravensmere on the 3rd of October. The house itself was a beautiful thing, red brick and cream stone, Georgian in its bones, set in Shropshire farmland gone gold and russet with the season. Lady Holbeck had been a friend of our mother's, which is why my brother agreed to come at all. There were 14 guests in the party, give or take the companions and attendants who occupied the margins of the social architecture, which is to say the chairs slightly to the left of the interesting chairs, and the seats at the end of the dinner table where the candlelight didn't reach. It was in one of those marginal chairs that I first saw Cecily Vane. She was seated beside Lady Holbeck at the far end of the drawing-room when we arrived, with a small book open in her lap, and a posture so composed it looked deliberate, the kind of stillness that comes not from idleness but from long practice at being unnoticed. She was 23, though I did not know that then. She was not, by the standards the drawing-room was applying that evening, remarkable. She was dressed plainly, a gray silk that had been well made some years prior and was maintained with care but could not disguise the years. Her hair was dark, simply arranged, with no curl work or ornamentation. Her face was fine-boned and serious, with eyes that looked at things rather than performing the act of looking. It was those eyes that my brother noticed first. He told me so later, in one of the few conversations about Cecily in which he was willing to be specific about his own interior experience. She was reading, he said, not pretending to read the way people do when they want to appear occupied, actually reading. And when she looked up and saw us come in, saw me, specifically with the whole room turning. She assessed the situation and went back to her page. He said this as though it explained everything. Perhaps it did. Her situation at Ravensmere was this. She was the paid companion of Lady Holbeck, employed some 6 months prior when the previous companion had departed to marry a curate in Derbyshire. Cecily's father, a Mr. Vane of Somerset, had been a gentleman of modest means who had lost those means in a series of investments that proved, in retrospect, to be wishes rather than plans. He had managed his small estate with more good intention than aptitude, borrowed once against a projected profit that did not materialize, and then borrowed again to service the first debt, and the architecture of it had come down around him with the particular finality of things that have been leaning for a long time. He had died the year before the Ravensmere gathering, leaving Cecily with a decent education. She had been the object of his particular pride in that respect, educated well above the level her station might have suggested was practical. A small wardrobe, no dowry, no connections, and the necessity of employment. She had taken the companion's position with Lady Holbeck because Lady Holbeck was a decent woman who treated her staff as human beings rather than furniture, and because the alternative was a schoolroom in Northumberland for which she had been shortlisted, and which offered a salary that would have covered her boots if she wore them sparingly. The companion's role was not what she had imagined for herself, when she had been young enough to imagine. But it was what was available, and she was practical enough to take it without making a performance of resignation. She was not introduced to the guests on the first evening. Companions rarely are. She sat in her chair and listened, and occasionally Lady Holbeck would turn to her for something, a name she'd forgotten, a book title, the location of the amber brooch she wanted to wear, and Cecily would provide it quietly, accurately, and without any visible opinion about the request. My Uncle Creswick, who arrived the following morning, walked past her 3 times in the corridor before acknowledging that she existed, and then only because she was standing between him and the door he wanted to open. My brother noticed her on the first evening. I noticed him noticing, which is its own kind of observation. He did not do anything obvious. He was not a man who did obvious things. But I saw where his eyes went when the room rearranged itself for conversation before dinner, and I saw the slight adjustment in his posture when she, without any apparent awareness of him, turned to answer Lady Holbeck's question and said something that made the old lady laugh properly. Not the polite flutter that passed for laughter at Ravensmere, but a real, warm, surprised laugh. My brother's expression, which is habitually arranged in what I privately call his garrison face, watchful and still, and revealing nothing, shifted by approximately 1 degree toward something else. I catalogued it and said nothing. I had seen my brother in drawing rooms for the 3 years, since his return from the continent. I had watched him manage them with an efficiency that admitted no engagement, the courteous answer, the correct nod, the exit at the earliest defensible moment. He was not unpleasant, he was simply elsewhere. You felt it when you spoke to him. Most of him was present, and some essential part was still in a field in Belgium or on the deck of a transport ship in the gray Atlantic, and it had not yet entirely made its way back. 19 months I had watched this. 6 days at Ravensmere apparently did what 19 months had not. The second day of the house party brought pheasant shooting for the men in the morning and a watercolor expedition for the ladies in the afternoon, during which my brother manufactured a headache and disappeared into the library. I did not believe the headache. I went to look for him in the library an hour later and found it empty. I then went to the garden, which seemed the next logical place for a man to be if he was avoiding drawing-room obligations and had no genuine headache, and found 2 people in the walled section of it. My brother, crouched beside the stone wall examining what appeared to be a particularly tenacious specimen of late autumn climbing rose, still managing 3 red blooms in October, and Cecily Vane, sitting on the bench near the south wall with a letter she was composing in a small notebook. She had looked up when he entered the garden. He had looked at her. There had been a moment in which both of them assessed the situation, the silence, the privacy, the mild impropriety of the meeting, and arrived, apparently, at the same conclusion, which was that neither of them was going to pretend they hadn't seen the other and leave. "Miss Vane," he said. He had learned her name then, or deduced it. "I apologize for interrupting." "You aren't interrupting, Your Grace," she said. "This is a garden. You have every right to be in it." "Do you?" She looked at him with those level eyes. "Lady Holbeck gave me the afternoon as she's with the watercolor party. She told me the walled garden has the last roses. She knows I like roses." "So do I," my brother said. And then, remarkably, he sat down on the other end of the bench. Not close, a proper distance. The distance of strangers who have mutually agreed to share a space without performing either intimacy or avoidance, and looked at the roses for a moment. "They shouldn't still be blooming," he said. "No," she agreed, "but here they are." He told me later that it was the cleanest conversation he'd had in 3 years. Not because the subject matter was profound. They talked about the garden, about her letter, to a friend in Somerset, she said, a schoolmistress who had been kind to her as a girl, about the shooting he'd excused himself from. He had not pretended to enjoy shooting since the war, and he did not explain why, and she did not ask. He noted this, he told me, that she did not ask. He was accustomed to people asking, or to people conspicuously not asking in a way that made the not asking itself a form of loud inquiry. She simply did not ask, because it was not her question to ask, and because she apparently understood the difference between interest and entitlement. He found this remarkable. He said so in his way, which was to not say so aloud, but to stay in the garden longer than anyone manufacturing a headache to escape a house party would ordinarily need to stay. At some point, the conversation moved, in the way that good conversations do without anyone steering them, into a discussion of the history of the house, which Cecily had been reading about in a volume she'd found in the library. He had opinions about the architectural period. She challenged one of them gently but with precision, citing a detail from the volume he had not considered. He considered it. He said she was probably right. She said, "You could check. The volume is on the second shelf from the window. It's green, rather battered. The illustration that proves the point is on page 43. He said, "I'll look tonight." She said, with the slight warmth that I was not there to see but can easily imagine, "It's the 17th century wing that gives it away. The Halbecks added it in 1683, and the records show the builder was working in the older style. A very stubborn man by the architectural evidence." "Stubborn is not always wrong," my brother said. "No," she said, "it isn't." There was a pause. The roses held their October position against the sky. He came back to the garden the following afternoon. She was there again. I do not think either of them planned it. I think they simply both understood that the garden was the one place at Ravensmere where you were permitted to be a person rather than a performing piece of the social architecture, and they had both arrived at the same need independently. There is a particular quality to the company of someone who does not require a performance from you, and when you have been performing for a long time, in my brother's case, performing survival, performing containment, performing the public face of a man who had left considerable quantities of himself in foreign soil. The presence of that particular quality is alarming in the best sense of the word. You notice it the way you notice the absence of a sound that has been there so long you stopped registering it. My Uncle Creswick noticed on the third day. I do not know precisely what he saw, whether someone reported the garden meetings, or whether he simply observed my brother's lack of interest in Lady Edwina Ashton with sufficient attention to follow the direction of his attention elsewhere. But at dinner on the third evening, I saw my uncle's gaze track from my brother's face to the end of the table where Cecily sat with the quieter, less prominent guests, and I saw the calculation settle across his expression like a shutter going down. He said nothing that evening. He was patient, my uncle. He had learned in a long life that the direct approach was useful for simple problems and catastrophic for complex ones, and he regarded my brother as a complex problem, one that required the right sequence of pressures rather than the immediate application of force. I watched him recalibrate and knew we were about to see the indirect method deployed. He began with it the following morning at breakfast. He sat beside my brother and spoke at some length about the duty of lineage, the responsibility of the duchy, the very great qualities of Lady Edwina Ashton, who was, he said, an exceptional young woman in every respect. My brother ate his eggs and said, at the intervals that required acknowledgement and nothing more. My uncle's jaw tightened by increments. "Edwina walks well," he tried, which I thought was a remarkable sentence to build an argument upon. "Many people walk well," my brother said. "She is accomplished. Her French is excellent. Her pianoforte is considered above average." "I don't require pianoforte," my brother said. "I have a pianoforte." He was not being rude. He was being my brother, which is to say that he was applying the same literal precision to the conversation that he applied to everything, and the literalness had the side effect of dismantling the romantic argument being constructed around him without him seeming to try. My uncle could feel the argument slipping, but could not identify where it was going, which was a frustration I observed from across the table with what I hope was sufficient concealment. "I merely mean," my uncle said, with the measured quality of a man who is not yet conceding ground but is choosing a less exposed position, "that she would make a capable duchess." "Capable is a very low word," my brother said. My uncle looked at him. "What word would you prefer?" My brother was quiet for a moment. He appeared to be considering with genuine seriousness, as though the question were not rhetorical. Then he said, "I would want someone who was honest." "Edwina is perfectly honest." "I'm sure she is," my brother said. He put down his fork. "I mean honest in the deeper sense. Someone whose honesty is so thorough that you feel the difference between being in the room with her and being in a room without her. Someone who makes you more yourself rather than less." He picked up his fork again. "That is the word I would want." There was a pause. "Practical considerations," my uncle began. "I have a practical estate," my brother said. "I would like an honest wife." He ate his eggs. My uncle did not. It was the 5th day that I came across the library evidence. My brother had been spending time there. This I knew, because the footman who managed the library's fire reported it, and because I had passed the library door twice in the late morning to hear the sound of more than one person moving inside. What I had not known, until I went in to retrieve a letter of my own that I believed I'd left on the writing table, was the extent of the campaign on the astronomical charts. The charts were laid across the library's largest table in a careful array, with small paper labels written in 2 different hands. I recognized my brother's handwriting, the military precision of it, tightly formed and angular, which was the handwriting of a man who had spent years writing dispatches on surfaces that were rarely stable. The other hand was smaller, rounder at the corners, with a slight leftward slope that I later learned was the result of Cecily being technically ambidextrous, but having been trained out of her left-hand preference at school, so that her right hand wrote almost perfectly, but with a ghost of the left-hand lean still in it. On the first chart, this matches the winter configuration, but the labeling suggests spring. V. Below January or February, I think look at the position of the outer planets. CV. On the second chart, the notation here is Hallbeck's, not the original catalogers. Someone added these annotations later and not very accurately. V. Below Lord Hallbeck III, I suspect. He bought these on the Grand Tour and apparently studied them enthusiastically without reference to anyone who actually studied astronomy. An optimist. CV. My brother's response, on a smaller slip of paper tucked beneath the chart. The worst catalogers are always the most enthusiastic. V. I read these exchanges with a feeling I will not characterize, because characterizing it would embarrass my brother if he ever reads this account. But I will say that I stood in the library for rather longer than it took to retrieve my letter, and the feeling was warm and entirely unambiguous. He was in love, in the way that people are in love when they have been waiting for something specific without knowing what it was, and then discovered it in the indexing system of a 17th century astronomical chart collection. I replaced the letters exactly as I'd found them, retrieved my own letter, and left. My uncle tried twice more over the following 2 days. Lady Edwina was maneuvered into sitting beside my brother at a card table. He played cards with her with perfect courtesy and talked about the autumn weather, which they agreed was fine for the season. She was placed beside him at dinner. He asked her about her family's estate in Hampshire, and she said it was very pleasant, and he said he had passed through Hampshire once or twice, and they agreed it was a pleasant county, and that appeared to exhaust the subject. Lady Edwina, to her credit, did not seem particularly distressed by this. I have a feeling she had been managed toward my brother without being consulted on the matter either, and was making the best of an arrangement she had not authored. There was, in her eyes, when she was not performing the expectation of enjoyment, a look that I recognized. The look of someone who would much rather be somewhere else and has made sufficient peace with not being there to get through the afternoon without complaint. Meanwhile, my brother was having his 4th and 5th conversations with Cecily in the library, because they had discovered, or rather, Cecily had discovered, and my brother had followed, that the library at Ravensmere contained a complete set of 17th century astronomical charts that had been acquired by the 3rd Lord Hallbeck on a grand tour and never properly organized. Cecily had been organizing them, in the hours when Lady Holbeck had no need of her, because she could not leave a disorder of that magnitude unaddressed. My brother had come in looking for a particular volume on military cartography and found her cross-legged on the library floor with charts spread in a careful semicircle around her, cataloging each one in a small notebook. He had looked at her. He had looked at the charts. He had sat down on the floor across from her, in his good coat and his immaculate riding breeches, and said, "May I help?" She had handed him a chart without looking up. They worked for 2 hours in a silence that I am told was entirely comfortable, and not silent in the way that silences between people who don't know what to say to each other are silent, but in the way that silence is between people who are thinking the same things and have discovered that thinking together does not require narration. At some point, Cecily asked him a question about the date of a particular cartographic convention. She had encountered the notation before but could not recall in what context, and he answered it precisely, and she wrote it down and thanked him, and they went back to their respective sections of the catalog. At some point, he asked her about the letter she had been writing in the garden, and she told him more about the friend in Somerset, a Miss Hartley, who had taught at the village school and was now the headmistress of a small girls' academy, which Cecily described with a warmth and pride that was not the warmth of acquaintance but of genuine admiration. He asked her what she admired about Miss Hartley. She said she decided what she wanted to do and then she did it, without apology and without waiting for anyone's permission. There was a pause in which my brother appeared to be absorbing this. "That must be a pleasant quality to witness," he said. "It is," Cecily said. "It's rarer than it ought to be." Another pause. "In women, you mean?" he said. "In anyone," she said. And she looked up at him, for the first time in that exchange, with the directness that I had been hearing described and was beginning to understand as simply characteristic of her, the look of someone who means what they say without any surrounding architecture of qualification. Though I think it is harder for women, the permission-seeking has more structural reinforcement. He said, she told me years later, "I think you don't wait for permission much." She thought about it. "I wait for it when waiting is correct," she said, "and I stop waiting when it's clear it isn't coming." He looked at her for a moment, then he went back to the chart in his hands. "This one," he said, "is definitely January. I know all of this because I came looking for my brother and found them, and because Cecily, over the years, proved to be an excellent narrator of her own life, precise and warm and willing to revisit the moments that mattered with the candor of someone who has sufficient distance on them to render them clearly. She told me pieces of that week at various intervals over the following years, fitting them together the way you fit the pieces of a catalog together, methodically, without rush, until the full picture is legible. What I had witnessed in the library doorway on that 5th afternoon was this. My brother, the Ward Duke of Veldmore, who had not sat on a floor in anyone's library in the 38 years of his existence that I could verify, sitting cross-legged in his good coat, across from a gentleman's daughter in gray silk, matching her focus and her precision, and her cheerful indifference to the existence of the rest of the house, sorting a century-old catalog with the same seriousness he had once brought to campaign maps. He was, I understood then, well and truly undone. He simply hadn't told anyone, including himself. The 6th evening of the house party brought a small dance. Not a ball, Lady Holbeck was at pains to explain, merely dancing, with a proper orchestra in the south drawing-room and the furniture cleared to the walls. The guests dressed accordingly, the ladies in their best evening silks, the gentlemen in their tailcoats, and the occasion generally arranged itself into the choreography of such evenings, which is to say that the young women of matrimonial interest were positioned to be asked, and the gentlemen of means were positioned to ask them. My brother danced with Lady Holbeck first, as courtesy required. He danced with the Countess of something or other second, because she was elderly and had known his mother. He did not, to my uncle's visible frustration, dance with Lady Edwina III. He stood near the window for what was possibly calculated to look like the interval between dances, watching the room. Cecily was not dancing. She was seated with the companion class of guests, 3 other women of similar marginal social position, along the north wall, where the candlelight was warm but the social attention was thin. She had been persuaded, I gathered, to wear a different gown for the evening, a blue-gray silk that was slightly better than the plain gray of her daily wear, with a narrow trim at the neck and cuffs that suggested she had taken some care with herself for the occasion. Her hair was arranged more formally, though simply. She looked, I thought, and I imagine my brother thought, though he expressed it differently, like a woman who had tried, quietly and without fuss, and the result was quietly and without fuss lovely. He crossed the room. The guests who noticed and the guests who did not notice were almost perfectly divided, which is a useful measure of any moment. The people paying genuine attention versus the people performing the performance of social life. I was in the first camp. My uncle, I saw, with the particular alertness of someone who has been watching for a danger he has not yet been able to name, was also in the first camp. My brother stopped in front of Cecily's chair. He offered his hand. The women seated around her became very still in the way that people become still when they are witnessing something they will be describing for months. Cecily looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. Then she said, with the perfectly level tone that I was already learning to recognize as characteristic of her when she was managing something that surprised her, "I am not very skilled, Your Grace." "Neither am I," he said, which was a lie. He was a perfectly competent dancer. But I understood what he was doing, and I thought it was rather well done. She took his hand. They danced, a cotillion, as it happened, which was a mercy because the cotillion requires attention to pattern and permits less sustained eye contact than a waltz, and sustained eye contact between the two of them in front of the assembled drawing room would have been entirely too much information for my uncle to process without an immediate scene. As it was, the dance gave them movement and proximity and the occasional meeting of hands in the figures, and I watched my brother's face through the pattern of the cotillion with the attention of someone who has been watching that face for 33 years and can read it as fluently as a map. He was not performing the dance, he was doing it. There is a difference that is very small and completely unmistakable. Performing a thing means some part of your mind is managing the impression it makes. Doing it means your whole mind is simply inside the thing. He was inside the dance, which meant he was inside the fact of dancing with her, which meant the garrison face was not there, and what was there instead was something I had not seen from that direction in a very long time. By the time it was over, the room's attention had sorted itself into the following camps. The curious and pleased Lady Hallbeck, who caught my eye and smiled at me with a warmth that told me she'd been watching for precisely this. The carefully neutral, most of the guests, hedging their bets on what it meant. And the alarmed, my uncle, who had placed his wine glass down on a table so precisely that the stem barely made a sound, and was looking at my brother with the expression of a general who has just watched his most reliable strategy undermined by an unforeseen variable. My brother returned Cecily to her chair after the dance. He did not linger. He was not an idiot, and prolonged attentiveness in front of the assembled house party would have done her no favors. But before he left, I saw him say something to her in a low voice that made her look up at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. Then he walked away, and she sat for a moment looking at her hands in her lap before she composed herself back into the posture of the useful, unnoticed companion. I thought, this is going to go badly before it goes well. I was right. My uncle came to my room that night. He did not knock because he was my uncle and had never in his life knocked at a door he felt entitled to open. I was still dressed. I had expected this visit. That, he said with no preamble, cannot be allowed to continue. He danced with her once, I said. People dance. She is a companion, my uncle said. She is a nobody. She is the daughter of a ruined man. She has no money, no family, no connections, and no prospects beyond the position she currently holds. She is entirely unsuitable. For what? He gave me the look that said I was being deliberately dense. For whatever this is becoming. I think, I said, that you would have to ask my brother what this is becoming. I have not been consulted. He is the Duke, my uncle said, as though this were a self-explanatory end to the argument. He has obligations. He has a name to maintain. He has. He fought for 4 years in the most brutal campaign in a generation, I said, with a mildness that did not represent my feeling on the subject. I think he has earned the right to have a conversation with a woman he finds interesting without requiring your assessment of her suitability. My uncle looked at me for a long moment. He was not, as I have said, a stupid man. He knew when he was being resisted, and he knew when the resistance was structural rather than tactical, when it was the resistance of someone who had made up his mind rather than the resistance of someone who could be argued to a different position. He saw both qualities in me and recalibrated accordingly. "You will not speak to him," he said. "It was not a question." "I will do no such thing." "Aldent." "Uncle Creswick," I said, "I will speak to my brother on precisely no subjects that are not his business to discuss with me and mine to discuss with him. His attachment, if there is an attachment, which is a question neither of us has the right to answer for him, is not one of those subjects. Good night." He left. I listened to his footsteps down the corridor, and then I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about what was coming. My brother was unaware of this conversation. I was virtually certain, in the library. He had a habit of going there late when the house settled. It was one of the ways he managed the residue of the war. The nights were not always easy, and a library is a good place to be when the mind will not quiet, because the pages of other people's thoughts offer a kind of company that does not require anything in return. I do not know if Cecily was there that particular night. I suspect she was not, because Lady Holbeck kept reasonable hours and her companion was expected to be available in the mornings. But I found out the following morning that he had been in the library, because I went there before breakfast and found two things. The first was an astronomical chart pinned carefully to the wall beside the window, oriented correctly. My brother had resolved the January question from the previous afternoon, with a note in his handwriting. I believe this is the June array. The labeling on the catalog entry appears to have been made by someone who had not checked the sky in some time. V. Below that, in smaller handwriting in a different ink, which meant it had been added earlier that morning before I arrived. Confirmed. Whoever cataloged this had never been south of Birmingham. CV. And below that, in my brother's hand, in a third ink, which meant he had added it that morning after she had. This seems to suggest you were here early. V. And below that, I like the library in the morning. CV. I put the note back where I found it, and went to breakfast with a feeling that was something between warmth and mild apprehension. The crisis came on the 7th day. I have reconstructed it from 3 sources. My own observation of the aftermath, what my brother told me after the fact, with the compression and selective omission characteristic of a man who does not enjoy explaining his feelings, and what Cecily told me some years later, with the precise and unhurried clarity of a woman who has had time to make sense of things and no longer needs to manage the emotion in the telling. What happened was this. My uncle went to Lady Holbeck that morning. He was courteous. He was always courteous in the opening moves of any maneuver. He thanked her for the party, praised the quality of the dancing, complimented her cook. And then, with the same precise timing he had used in 20 years of political maneuvering, he raised the question of Cecily Vane. He said, and Lady Holbeck told my brother this verbatim, because Lady Holbeck, to her great credit, was furious, that he was concerned. He said he was sure it was nothing, merely a young woman in a difficult position doing what young women in difficult positions sometimes did, which was attach themselves to proximity to wealth and title. He said he hoped Lady Holbeck would understand that it was better for everyone, including Miss Vane, if the matter were addressed before it went any further. He said he would hate for Miss Vane to develop expectations that could not, in good conscience, be fulfilled. He said all of this in the tone of a man performing a kindness that was costing him something, and he concluded by noting that he imagined Lady Holbeck would know best how to handle the situation, as Miss Vane was, after all, her responsibility. Lady Holbeck was 71 years old and had known my uncle since he was 40. She recognized what she was being asked to do. What I do not know, what I have never been entirely certain of, is whether what happened next was Lady Holbeck doing as she was asked, or Lady Holbeck doing what she believed was right for Cecily regardless of my uncle's framing. She was a decent woman, as I said. Decent women in that era were constrained in ways that make clear motives difficult to assign. She may have believed that removing Cecily from the house party early was a protection. She may have believed she had no real choice once my uncle had named the problem and made it, thereby, real. She may simply have been 71 and tired and unable to think of another way. What I know is that she told Cecily the situation clearly afterward. She did not pretend the letter from Chester was real for longer than it took Cecily to understand what was happening, and she apologized, and she pressed money into her hand, and she said she was sorry, and that she hoped Cecily would find a position worthy of her, and that she would provide the best possible reference whenever it was needed. She called Cecily to her sitting room that morning and told her that circumstances required an early departure. She was vague about the specifics, because she was still finding words for a conversation she had not wanted to have. She said she was sorry to cut the party short. She said she thought, given the situation, it would be best if Cecily accompanied her. She gave Cecily what I am told was a genuine look of regret, and the extra month's wages, and the knowledge, not quite spoken, that the companion had understood precisely what had happened and was making it easy for her by not requiring it to be said fully aloud. Cecily understood. She was not someone who needed a map. She went to her room and she packed her things. My brother did not know any of this until the afternoon, when he went to the library at the hour they had fallen, by unspoken mutual agreement, into the habit of occupying at the same time. The library was empty. The notes were on the chart where he had left them. The catalog was where they had set it. But the second chair, the one she preferred, slightly to the left and angled toward the light, was empty in a way that was different from the ordinary emptiness of a chair. He sat in his own chair and looked at hers for a moment. Then he went to find her. She was not in the garden. She was not in the morning room, which was where Lady Holbeck's companions generally retired when not required. He asked one of the Ravensmere footmen, who told him that Miss Vane had been in the house all morning, but had not come down for luncheon, and her trunk had been brought downstairs at noon. He was still for a moment. He came to find me. He did not say anything about the library or the chair. He said, "Do you know where Miss Vane is?" "I don't," I said, "but I have a thought about what may have happened." I told him about my uncle's visit to my room the previous night. I told him what had been said. I did not editorialize. My brother listened with the focused stillness that he brought to intelligence reports, and when I finished he sat without speaking for a moment that lasted approximately 4 heartbeats. Then he said, "Thank you," and stood up and went to find Lady Holbeck. The conversation between them was brief. Lady Holbeck told him what had occurred. She told him what she had asked Cecily to do. She told him about the money and the reference and the genuine sorrow, and she said, and this is the part that I think mattered most, though my brother related it without emphasis, that she was sorry, and that she hoped he understood she was placed in a difficult position. My brother said he did understand. He said it without blame, which Lady Holbeck later told me she had not expected and for which she was grateful. He asked her one question: where had Cecily gone? She had gone to the village inn. She had no carriage of her own, and the next coach to Somerset did not pass through until the morning. She was waiting. My brother went to the stables without informing anyone of his destination or intention. He saddled his grey himself, which was not the normal course of events for a man of his position, but was entirely in keeping with the normal course of events for a man of his particular character when the normal channels seemed too slow. He rode the 1.5 miles to the village of Ravensmere Cross in the thin October afternoon light, and he found the inn, and he asked the innkeeper, and he found Cecily in the small parlor they had put her in, sitting very straight in a chair that was too upright for comfort, with her trunk at the door and her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he came in. She did not look surprised, or rather she looked surprised for approximately 1 second, and then she looked like herself, composed, clear-eyed, a little tired. "Your Grace," she said, "you didn't have to come." "I know," he said. He sat down in the chair across from her, which was as small and upright as hers, and entirely wrong for a man of his size. He looked at her. "I want to ask you something." "All right," he said, and I am giving you his words, though I received them third-hand from Cecily years later, and she said she had never forgotten them. "I am not good at speeches. I have spent 4 years at war and 3 years trying to remember what I was before the war, and I have not entirely succeeded. I have a title that comes with a great deal of expectation and very little latitude. I have an uncle who has decided it is his purpose to manage me, and I have not, until now, been particularly moved to resist him on the specific subject of marriage, because no one until now has made me feel that the subject warranted the energy of resistance. You have made me feel that. I would like to know if you would be willing to marry me." Cecily looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "That is a very unusual proposal." "I am aware. You have known me for 6 days. 7, he said. "I counted the garden." She looked at her hands, then she looked back at him. "I have no money, no connections. I am a companion. Your uncle believes I am a scheming." "I know what my uncle believes," he said. "I am not asking you to marry my uncle." There was a silence. If I said yes, she said carefully, I would need you to understand that I would not want you to think I don't think you anything except the most honest person I have met in 3 years, he said, and I have spent those 3 years in considerable company. Another silence. The inn fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons do in Shropshire, which is to give the light a quality that makes distances look both further and more navigable at the same time. She said, "Why?" He knew she wasn't asking why he had come to the inn. He was quiet for a moment, the careful quiet of a man who is going to tell the truth and is thinking about how to tell it accurately rather than impressively. "Because," he said finally, "when I am in the same room with you, I am entirely present, not managing the room, not performing it, not waiting to be finished with it. Present. That has not happened to me in a very long time. I don't want to lose it." She looked at him, he looked at her. The inn fire said what it always says, which is nothing useful and nothing useless. "Yes," she said. He did not, she told me, immediately stand up and announce triumph. He sat very still for a moment in the upright chair that was entirely wrong for him, and he said, "Thank you," as though she had done him a genuine kindness. And then more quietly, "I'll try to deserve it." She said, "I expect you to. I don't say yes to things I haven't thought about." He almost smiled. She saw it, told me she saw it, that first near smile, which had the quality of something that had been a long time coming and had finally arrived. Then he said, "There will be a difficulty with my uncle. I want you to know that I intend to deal with it, and that the outcome will not change." "I know," she said. "I am not afraid of difficulties." He looked at her. "No," he said, "I know you're not." He helped her with her trunk. He brought her back to Ravensmere on his grey. She rode pillion, which was not strictly proper, and neither of them cared. And he brought her through the front door, which was also not strictly proper, and neither of them cared. And he handed her into Lady Holbeck's care with a look that communicated several things at once, most of them in the category of gratitude, and one of them in the category of something that is not a threat, but has the structural form of one. Lady Holbeck burst into tears. She was a sentimental woman when her guard came down, and her guard had come down somewhere on the road between the house party she had arranged and the one that was apparently occurring in its place. She pressed Cecily's hands and called her dear girl, and said she was very sorry, and Cecily said there was nothing to be sorry for, which was generous and possibly not entirely true. But Cecily was not the kind of person who required apologies to be labored at length once their cause had been addressed. My uncle was not immediately informed. This was, I suspect, tactical. He was informed the following morning. My brother came to the breakfast table at his usual hour, which was early, a war habit that had never left him. My uncle was there, as he generally was, because my uncle believed that the breakfast table was a strategic position worth occupying. Several of the other guests were present. The Ashtons, including Lady Edwina, who was applying herself to her toast with the expression of someone who has decided to let the morning proceed without her particular involvement. A couple called the Berridges, who were genial and largely decorative, and Sir Thomas Aldwyck, an old friend of the late Duke, who had come mainly to ride the Ravensmere parkland and had been largely indifferent to the social machinations of the week. My brother sat down. He poured his coffee. He said, with the same directness he had always brought to everything, "I spoke with Miss Vane yesterday. I have asked her to marry me, and she has agreed." The table received this in several ways simultaneously. Lady Edwina Ashton did not change her expression. Her father, the Earl, went very still in the manner of a man recalibrating an investment. The Berridges exchanged a delighted glance. Sir Thomas said, "Well done, Veldmore," in the tone of a man who means it. My uncle said nothing for 4 seconds, which was a long time for him. Then he said, "That is not possible." "I assure you it is," my brother said. He was buttering his toast. He did it with the same precision he gave everything. "She is a companion," my uncle said. "She was a companion. She will shortly be my wife." "Veldmore," my uncle's voice had dropped to the register it used when he wished to be understood as serious, which was a register that had quieted rooms for 40 years. "You cannot do this. A man of your position does not." "Be careful," my brother said. He looked up from his toast. His eyes were the color of the Veldmore coast in autumn, and they had the same quality the coast has in autumn, which is the quality of something not to be pushed further. Be very careful what you say next." The table had gone entirely still. Even the footmen, who are trained to be invisible, appeared to be exercising unusual effort in that direction. My uncle saw the room. He understood, with the intelligence that had served him for 40 years, that the room was watching and that what he said next would be a matter of record. He said it anyway. He was not a man who retreated from a prepared position because the audience was inconvenient. He said, loudly enough to be heard by the whole table, "A duke does not marry beneath him." He said it as though it were a law of nature, as though it settled the matter, as though the 38 years of my brother's life, and the 4 years of war, and the 3 years of silence, and the 7 days of autumn, and the upright chair in the village inn could be undone by the adequate pronouncement of a social principle. My brother put down his toast knife. He looked at my uncle across the breakfast table for a moment that lasted long enough for everyone in the room to understand what was about to happen. The moment had a particular quality, the quality that precedes things that are permanent, that cannot be unsaid once they are said. Then he stood up, he picked up his coffee. He said, "I will be marrying Miss Vane at the parish church on Saturday." He left the room. My uncle remained at the table. The room did not know where to look, and so various guests made the choice that people make when they witness something significant and are uncertain of their own position. They looked at their plates. I, for one, looked at Sir Thomas Aldwyck, who was the only person in the room expressing anything resembling a clean emotion, which was quiet satisfaction. He caught my eye. He raised his coffee cup approximately 1 centimeter in what I read as a salute. I raised mine in return. The silence around the table held for a moment longer. And in that silence, I think, was the particular sound of a social architecture coming apart at the joints, not with a crash, but with the small, precise sounds of things that have been held in place by the weight of expectation, and have now been relieved of that weight and do not know what else to be. Saturday. In the history of the Duchy of Veldmore, my brother's marriage was the fastest on record, and I am including a great-great-uncle who married his cook in an emergency during a flood in 1743 and required 3 seconds of deliberation. My brother applied for the license on Thursday. The license was granted. The parish church of Ravensmere Cross was available. The vicar, a young man named Mr. Pembury, who had been at the house party's edges all week in the capacity of spiritual and conversational decoration, and who turned out, on closer acquaintance, to be a man of genuine feeling and considerable good humor, said he would be honored. The witnesses were myself and Lady Hallbeck, who had declared by this point a complete reversal of allegiance so thoroughgoing that she offered to host the wedding breakfast at Ravensmere Park, and pressed Cecily's hand in her own every time they were in the same room, and cried at intervals without apparent embarrassment. She also insisted on supervising the pressing of Cecily's best gown, which Cecily accepted with the gracious practicality that characterized her acceptance of everything, gratitude without performance, warmth without excess. My uncle did not attend. He left Ravensmere on Friday morning in a carriage that departed at a pace suggesting departure rather than conclusion, and he did not say goodbye to my brother or to me, and his absence from the church the following morning was the most information-rich absence in the room. The Earl of Ashton left on Friday as well with Lady Edwina, and I think, though I can only speculate, that Lady Edwina's private feelings were something close to relief, though she would never have said so, and I have always hoped she found someone for whom the subject of Hampshire could be properly explored. The Barrages stayed for the wedding. Sir Thomas Aldwyck stayed. Several others of the party who had been watching all week with the carefully neutral expression of guests who do not wish to commit until the result is clear now committed, and committed warmly because the result was clear and the warmth of it was, as I said, something you could feel from across the room. On Friday evening, my brother came to find me. He sat in the chair in my room, the good one, the one I had placed near the window, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he is quiet when he is deciding whether to say something. "Are you all right?" I asked. "Yes," he said. Then, after a pause, "I want to apologize for not speaking to you about it as it was happening. I wasn't sure I could put it into words." "You don't need to apologize for that. I know you saw it," he looked at his hands, "in the library. I didn't announce myself." "No," he said, "thank you for that." A pause. "And for the other thing, telling me about Creswick's visit, if you hadn't." "You would have found out," I said. Perhaps he was quiet for another moment, but perhaps not in time. I thought about Cecily in the inn parlor. The upright chair, the hands folded in her lap. She was going to go, I said, in the morning. I know, he said. She would have gone. I know, he said again, and I heard in the two syllables the full weight of that knowledge, the understanding of how close it had been to not being the story I was going to be able to tell. We sat together for a while. The October evening came through the window, doing its October things. She is, he said finally, the most. He stopped. I know, I said. He looked at me. Then he almost smiled, which was, as I have said, a significant event. You have not heard the end of the sentence, he said. I don't need to, I said. I've been watching you for a week. He was quiet for a moment. Then she catalogued 17 charts today, he said. In between all of this, she catalogued 17 charts and arranged them chronologically by hemisphere and wrote up the complete index and said it only needed the cross-references now. He said it with the tone of a man describing something extraordinary. I thought about what it cost to be that composed, and I thought about what Cecily Vane had built herself out of, and I thought that my brother, who knew something about being built out of necessity, had recognized it. She'll be good at Veldmore, I said. Yes, he said, she will. I will tell you about the morning of the wedding, because it is the part of all of this that I come back to when I want to understand what I witnessed that week. The church at Ravensmere Cross was small, stone, Norman at its foundation, with a few centuries of addition around the edges, with windows that let in a cold, clear October light, and a smell of candle wax and old wood, and something else underneath both, which is the smell of time accumulated in a building where people have been bringing their most serious occasions for 800 years. The flowers were late autumn things, rose hips, bronze chrysanthemums, a few stubborn roses that Lady Halbeck had retrieved from the walled garden. The pews held the witnesses and friends. There was no orchestra, no procession of splendor, no cathedral organ. There was the light and the flowers, and the particular seriousness of an occasion that has not been arranged to impress anyone, and is therefore entirely itself. My brother stood at the front of the church and waited. I stood beside him, as the best man he had asked me to be the previous evening with the economy of speech that characterized all of his requests. Alden, Saturday, would you? He was wearing his best dark coat, not the tailcoat of a drawing-room performance, but something more sober and better. The coat of a man who takes the occasion seriously, but not as theater. He was very still. Not the stillness of endurance, which was a stillness I had learned to recognize over the years. The stillness of a man who has stood in many situations in which being still was a form of survival. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who is waiting for the specific thing he wants, and the waiting is not quite comfortable, but the wanting is so clear that the discomfort doesn't signify. The church door opened. Cecily came in on the arm of Mr. Pembury, who had offered himself for the purpose with cheerful pragmatism when it became apparent that there was no father or male relation available. She was wearing a gown that was not grand. She had nothing grand in her wardrobe, and there had been no time to commission anything, and she had not asked for anything because she was Cecily. But it was the best she had, a pale silver-gray silk that Lady Halbeck had pressed to within an inch of its life that morning, and that had small seed pearls at the cuffs that I think had belonged to her mother. Her hair was simply arranged, with a few flowers, one of those stubborn October roses from the walled garden, dark red against the dark of her hair. She walked steadily. She did not look at the witnesses and the friends arranged in the pews, or rather she looked at them with the brief, acknowledging assessment she brought to every room she entered, and then she looked forward at my brother, and the assessment stopped being an assessment and became something else. She was not afraid, I think, or rather she was exactly as afraid as she was willing to be controlled by it, which was not much. He looked at her. I have been in the same room as men who loved their wives, and men who were performing love for the room's consumption, and I have been in the same room as my brother's face in that moment, and there is no taxonomical confusion about which category it belonged to. It was the face of a man looking at the specific thing he wanted to spend the rest of his life near, not performing the looking, not constructing it, just doing it, the way you do the things that don't require thought. She reached the front of the church. She stood beside him. Mr. Pemberry, who had a pleasant voice and an evident feeling for the gravity of the occasion, began the service. My brother said his vows with the precision and seriousness he gave to everything, and with a warmth in the precision that I had not heard from him in a long time. The warmth was not ornamental, it was structural. It was the warmth of something that had been decided upon and was now being made permanent, and the decision was not in question, and had not been in question for several days, and the permanence was not something to perform but something to finally, formally, acknowledge. Cecily said hers with the steady voice of someone who means every word and is not going to waste any of them on performance. When Mr. Pemberry asked the assembled witnesses if anyone knew a reason the marriage should not proceed, there was a silence in which the ghost of my Uncle Creswick was audible, and then the silence closed over it and became merely a silence, and Mr. Pemberry proceeded. He slid the ring on her finger. It was the Veldmore ring, the one that had been his mother's, a simple band of gold with a line of blue stones that had always struck me as looking rather like the color of the Veldmore coast, which is to say not precisely gray and not precisely blue, but the color of something that has survived a great deal of weather. She looked at it, then she looked at him. He was looking at her. "Well," Mr. Pemberry said, with the particular warmth of a man who has just had the privilege of conducting something real, "you may." My brother had already kissed her. He did it with the same directness he brought to everything. Not a performance for the room, not a hesitant thing, but a real and present act that was also quiet and brief, and told the room everything it needed to know about the nature of what had just been established. The witnesses applauded. Lady Halbeck, beside me, made a sound that had no name in any language, but communicated a complex mixture of triumph and tenderness, and the specific relief of a woman who has done something complicated and had it come right. Sir Thomas Aldwych said under his breath, "Well done." I said nothing. I was busy being, for the first time in a very long time, entirely sure that the world was not irredeemably broken. The wedding breakfast at Ravensmere was generous and warm and informal in the way that events become informal when the architecture of pretension has been removed. Lady Halbeck's cook had outdone herself. The Barrages were excellent company. Mr. Pemberry discovered a mutual interest in 17th-century cartography with Cecily. She told him about the astronomical charts in the library, and he told her about a volume he owned that described the same period's navigational innovations. And my brother sat beside her, and listened to this conversation with the look of a man who is entirely happy to listen to someone he loves talking to someone they've just discovered is interesting. My uncle's absence was present in the room the way absences are when the person's absence is itself a statement. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. The chair that would have been his was occupied by Sir Thomas, who filled it admirably. At some point in the afternoon, I found myself in the walled garden, alone, briefly, while the others were still at table or had moved into the drawing-room for music. The roses were still there. 3 of them dark red, doing what they had no business doing in October, and doing it without any apparent interest in the opinion of the season. I stood and looked at them for a while. I thought about my brother at 38, coming home from a war he had survived by being willing to hold the things that mattered more than his own comfort. I thought about Cecily at 3 and 20, sitting in the walled garden with a letter to her friend, and a composure that had been built, clearly, from the same material as necessity. The kind of composure that is not coldness but is exactly the amount of warmth, given out exactly as far as the situation warrants, and no further, until the situation warrants more. I thought about the particular gravity of finding, in a house party, of all places, at a country estate in Shropshire in October, the specific person who makes the world make sense again. The war had taken something from my brother that 3 years of peacetime had not returned. I had watched him manage his estate, decline his invitations, attend his debates, and I had thought with the helpless clarity that you have about people you love. He is here, but something essential is still somewhere on the continent, or in the ground at the places he never names, or in the silence that lives behind his eyes when he thinks no one is watching. I had not known how to give it back. I had not known if anything could. 7 days, apparently. Or rather, 7 days and a woman who went back to her letter when a feared duke walked into the garden, and who challenged his reading of a cartographic source, and who had written CV. Under his annotations with the cheerful precision of someone who understood that doing a thing correctly was its own reward, and who said, "Yes, in an upright chair in a village inn with the composure of someone for whom bravery is not the absence of fear, but simply the next logical step after fear, because the alternative is a life lived sideways to everything real. I went back inside. My brother and his wife, I was already thinking of her as his wife, the words settling into place with the ease of things that have been true for longer than the paperwork acknowledges, were standing at the window of the drawing room looking out at the park. They were not speaking. They were close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and their faces were turned toward the same horizon, and in the attitude of that shared looking there was something so settled and so right that I stopped in the doorway for a moment before I crossed the room. He must have heard my step. He turned his head and looked at me, and I saw in his face, in the particular quality of the stillness, what had been missing for 3 years and was no longer missing, and I thought, there it is. There it is. He did not say anything. He did not need to. I went to the side table and poured myself a glass of wine, and raised it toward him in the gesture that had meant, between us since we were boys, the full range of things that neither of us was very good at saying aloud. He raised his in return. Cecily, beside him, looked from one of us to the other with the expression of a woman who has just perceived a private language and is filing it for future reference. "He does that," she said to me, with the same level tone I already knew meant she was warmer than she was letting on, "when he's pleased about something." "He does," I agreed. "It's his entire emotional vocabulary, that gesture." My brother looked at both of us with the expression of a man who is being narrated against his will, and has decided it isn't worth the effort to protest. "I have a perfectly adequate vocabulary," he said. "You do," Cecily said. She looked up at him. "I know." He looked at her, and there was in his looking, in the specific quality of it, the directness that had nothing held back, the whole story of the week. The garden, the library, the chart on the wall, the upright chair, the parish church, the ring that was the color of the Veldmore coast. The full and particular account of a man who had found, in a place he had not been looking for anything, the one person who made the silence livable and the living worth the silence. I have never seen my brother afraid in the conventional meaning of the word. I have seen him manage things that would have unmanned most people, with a quietness that suggested fear was simply a weather condition he knew how to dress for. But I think I have always thought that the bravest thing I ever saw him do was sit down in an upright chair in a village inn, and ask a woman with nothing to recommend her but herself whether she would do him the very great honor. He was right to be afraid if he was, and she was right to say yes. The morning after the wedding, my uncle wrote a letter. He wrote one to my brother and one to me, and both letters were in the same register, formal, unrecanting, the letter of a man who has set down a position and, finding it unchanged in the morning, intends to hold it. He did not wish the marriage well. He said he hoped my brother understood the implications of his choice. He said he remained my brother's affectionate uncle and hoped that in time the situation might be. He used the word rationalized, which I thought was remarkable, rationalized. My brother read his letter. He put it down. He said, "He'll come around." "Do you believe that?" I asked. He considered. "Probably not in the way I'd prefer," he said, "but he'll run out of resistance before I run out of patience. I have had considerably better practice at holding positions than he has." This was, as it turned out, accurate. My uncle maintained his disapproval for approximately 14 months, at which point he came to Veldmore House for a dinner that my brother had invited him to with the same undiscourageable courtesy he brought to everything, and he sat across the table from Cecily, who was by that point over a year married and entirely settled into her position, which is to say that she had reorganized the Veldmore estate correspondence with the same systematic clarity she had brought to the astronomical charts. Identified 3 errors in the household accounts that no one else had caught, one of which had been present for 11 years, learned the names of every member of the staff in the first week and the names of their families by the end of the month, and was, by the account of everyone in the house from the steward to the youngest kitchen girl, as natural a mistress of it as though she had been born to the purpose, which was to say that she was thorough and warm and had opinions, and was willing to be wrong about them, and was interested in the estate not as a social stage, but as a living thing. My uncle said something at dinner that evening, some remark, I think, about the new organization of the library, and Cecily responded to it with the same precision and warmth that she brought to everything, and caught him in an error of historical attribution that she corrected so gently that he didn't notice it was a correction until he'd already agreed with her. He looked at her across the table for a moment afterward. Something shifted in his expression, some small recalibration, the kind that happens when the world turns out to be slightly different in a particular corner from what your long-held map has indicated. He did not apologize. He was not a man who apologized. But from that dinner onward, he began speaking about my nephew's wife, in company with a tone that was not quite pride but occupied the same territory, and when people asked about the Duchess of Veldmore, he said, with the precision of a man choosing words carefully, "She is entirely capable," which, from him, and given everything, was quite a great deal. The summer after the wedding, I visited Veldmore. It was the first time I had been there in 3 years, and I want to tell you what I saw because it is the thing I come back to, the image that settles the account of everything that week at Ravensmere had set in motion. I arrived in the early afternoon. The house was in good order, better order, actually, than I had seen it in many years. There was a quality of attention to it that hadn't been there before, a sense that someone was not only maintaining it but caring for it, which are two different things. The garden had been restored to a version of itself that the current generation had never seen, but that old engravings of the estate showed had been its original character. The formal beds brought back, the orchard wall repaired, the kitchen garden reorganized along the lines of the records Cecily had found in the estate archive indicating what it had looked like in the previous century. The library, the great library, 2 floors, a gallery, 10,000 volumes, had been catalogued. Actually catalogued, for the first time in a century, in a system that Cecily had designed, and my brother had improved upon, and together they had spent the previous winter implementing, working in the evenings after the estate business was done, and sometimes, I gathered, in the early mornings before it began, and which the Veldmore librarian had called, with a reverence I found both charming and wholly appropriate, the most rational thing that has ever been done to this room. I found them in the garden. It was July, and the roses were properly, seasonally, in full bloom, not the stubborn 3 in October roses of Ravensmere, but roses in their right time, a great bank of them along the south wall, and in the middle of them my brother and his wife, sitting on a bench in approximately the same arrangement as 2 people I had once seen in a walled garden in Shropshire. Close together, not speaking, both of them turned toward the same thing, which was the quality of the afternoon and the roses, and the fact of being precisely where they were. She said something. He laughed, a real laugh, not his polite acknowledgement of humor, but the actual thing, which I had not heard in a very long time, and which had the quality of a sound that has been retrieving itself from somewhere and has finally arrived. The sound of it was so clean and so uncomplicated that I stopped walking for a moment on the garden path, simply to let it settle. She turned when I came through the garden gate. She smiled at me the way she smiled at me, which was warm and without performance, and occasionally included the very slight extra warmth of a woman who knows you were on her side when it mattered and has never forgotten it. "Alden," she said, "you're late." "I am exactly on time," I said. "You were expected at noon." "I am here at 2, I said, which is on time for me, as anyone who knows me will confirm. My brother looked at me with the expression of a man who has been informed of my tendency toward inexactness and takes it as a manageable character feature rather than a deficiency. "Come and sit," he said. I sat. The roses bloomed. The afternoon did what July afternoons in England do, which is to say it gave the light a quality that makes you think the world has been arranged for comfort, even though you know it hasn't and is often not. I sat in the garden with my brother and his wife, the woman his uncle had called beneath him, the woman he had married in 6 days, the woman who had catalogued the astronomical charts and corrected the historical attribution, and finished the cross-references on the Veldmore library in the evenings of a Shropshire winter, and said yes in an upright chair in a village inn with the steadiness of someone who had decided that bravery was simply the next step after knowing what you wanted. And I thought. As I had thought standing in the walled garden at Ravensmere, with 3 October roses doing what they had no business doing. There it is. The most powerful man I knew, in a garden with his wife, laughing in July, in the house that had been waiting for someone who would care about it. That is what devotion looks like when the right person finds it. Not a performance before a shocked drawing room, not a triumph over the sneering voices, though all of those things were also true and I will not diminish them. It looks like this, Two people in the middle of the summer roses turned toward the same direction with no obligation to be anywhere else and nowhere else they want to be. He had been right in the end to hold the line. He always was.